Guess who? It's the Kaijuologist, bitches. And I'm back. I knew I wouldn't leave you forever. I've been a very busy Kaijuologist. You know, I'm a performance artist here in the Mile High City. I've got 3 different shows going on right now. And then I was actually up in my home state of Montana, represent the Big Sky, visiting some family. But I have not forgotten about you, and I have not forgotten about the genre that brings us together. Tonight's episode, this is brought to you by Nebula Organic Wine. I don't know if you can even see that. Anyway, I thought that was cool. Nebula wine. It's very apropos, because tonight we'll be discussing one of, I think maybe a few kaiju to stem from a nebula. This one, being the original, stems from a gaseous nebula. And it is, of course, the crowd-pleasing Smog monster Hedorah himself, herself. I don't think that monster needs a gender. Bottoms up. Not bad, not bad. Now, this was actually one of my friends over on the Toho Kingdom forums requested this. And then I had another friend, the Kaiju no Kami. You should check out his channel, Kaiju Nokami. Excellent stuff. But he had a terrific review on it, and I love that because I'm actually a pretty big fan of this film. I know it's really divisive within the fan base, and I think that's actually a good thing. I think what that means is our director Yoshimitsu Banno went far enough off the track here that he did kind of upset the system that the Godzilla franchise had fallen into. I think that's a good thing that there are so many different opinions, but some of the opinions, frankly, are harsh. One of them, you know, being that this really moved the whole genre into just being strictly kiddie fare, which I think, coming off of Godzilla's Revenge, this is such a wild improvement. I can't understand that criticism. The next film, Godzilla vs. Gigan, has no kids in it. In fact, the majority of the rest of the Showa series doesn't have many kids in it. I don't see how this is a kid's movie just because there's a kid in it and we have like some cute pop culture music going on. This is also, though, the first time in a Godzilla movie we have people doing drugs. We are seeing, for the first time since really 54, back with the original Gojira, we are seeing mass casualties. It's being discussed, and we are witnessing people actually being murdered by the Smog monster. There's also an interesting kind of sexual thing going on in this movie. I know that might sound a little nuts at first. I'll get to that later on. So maybe let's start with the way I categorize the films, being the versus category, kaiju adventure, or a solo adventure. Godzilla vs. Hedorah, very much a versus film, and admittedly kind of a problematic one. This movie, I actually watched it about a week ago, and I've been trying to really digest it and think about it. It might be a stronger kaiju film in general than it is actually a strong Godzilla film. This has to be one of the weirdest and laziest executions of Godzilla. He really does just show up with no explanation. There is no, even Godzilla vs. Megalon builds in plot points to help us understand why Godzilla is in Japan fighting other monsters. We could have worked in something about Japan being Godzilla's turf. We could have had just a little, I don't know, exposition to help us out here. Instead, he's just here. And I know it pisses off some fans because it feels very Gamera-esque that, you know, we have the little kid who just hero worships Godzilla, and Godzilla just shows up. It's really inexplicable, and it's kind of a shame. The Godzilla suit, not terrible. I think it looks a little more ferocious, a little less friendly than it did initially when we debuted it with Destroy All Monsters. But this is the last time it looks good. You know, how terrible it is in Gigan is the stuff of kaiju fan lore. So yeah, Godzilla. It's a weird film for Godzilla, and then especially the jet propelled sequence at the end where Godzilla can fly now. It's funny, I guess. I understand that Yoshimitsu Bano, our director, put it in to help balance out how dark the movie actually is. This film goes to places a lot of kaiju films don't in general, and certainly for where Toho was at the time. This is a dark film in a lot of ways. The imagery is not happy, comfortable time. So he wanted to balance some of this out. This is my theory, I think he is kind of jabbing the Gamera series here a little bit. Because so much of this film, the heavy inclusion of the kid, Godzilla is just kind of the random savior. There's no build up for why Godzilla's there. It all feels a bit more like a Gamera film in that sense. And I think it almost was maybe a joke he was having of, oh, your flying monster, your turtle flies? Well, guess what? Godzilla flies now too, bitches. Suck it and watch this terrible sequence. And it goes on way, way too long. Ooh, interesting stuff. Let's move on to Hedorah. This is a cool monster. This is a very unique monster. I like... So, one of the ways I judge a versus film is how good are the characterizations of the monsters. Hedorah just, literally oozes kind of a menacing, nasty vibe. It's a great villain kaiju, and it puts up an interesting fight, too, in that you see lots of different tactics. For a giant pile of sludge, Hedorah frequently surprises you with what it pulls out. I admit, I'm not the hugest fan of the final big costume, that, the final form of Hedorah. It's not that it's terrible, it's just that it's so clunky and bulky that the melee fighting isn't quite as exciting as it should be. We still get to see Godzilla pop the sucker in the eye. We see them go tumbling down a hill. It's not that there's a lack of melee fighting, it's just that the first suit we initially see Godzilla fight in the very first sequence, I think it's in Tokyo Bay or something, when it's crawling around, it's a little smaller, it just feels a little more agile. It just opens up more room for different possibilities, I suppose. And the big final suit is just so cumbersome, it feels like. So then from here, let's maybe get into the actual plot here. It's not terrible. In fact, one thing they execute very well is the pacing of this movie. Not until Mechagodzilla do we get such good pacing again. And really not... It's one of the better examples in kaiju films in general. The way we see Hedorah pretty early on, and then the tension really becomes more about what form is it going to take, what's it going to do next, instead of, who is this monster, what does it even look like, when is it going to show up? Both, or I guess more so Gigan, just it feels like forever till we actually even see Gigan. I think they did a good job here of keeping things clipping along. The characters are kind of a mixed bag. I know the little kid is Kenny, because I think that's apparently the name for all Japanese little boys in these films at the time. But so we have Kenny's dad, the doctor, we have doctor's wife, and then we have our hipster and his girlfriend. Hippie hipster dude is the doctor's brother. At least he called him brother. I was watching the Japanese with subtitles. They said brother, but nothing else in the film ever remotely comes close to tackling this. And his girlfriend is just, she's kind of useless, as is the doctor's wife. She doesn't really get much to do in the film. I understand, and I forget if I read this somewhere, if someone explained this in an earlier review, that this was really critical for Tomoyuki Tanaka, that he wanted this movie to involve kids. I think, again, they're worried about where the Gamera series is going. They know right now in Japan, the Ultraman series is picking up. They want to get that kiddie market in and watching the kaiju films. This, though, is maybe one of the more successful kaiju films to utilize kids. And it's a chicken or the egg debate here, but so much of the commentary Banno is putting into his film revolves around this discussion of the past generation and the new generation, the upcoming generation, that I almost wonder, even if it hadn't been, an imperative written into this film that there has to be a kid involved, he might have done it anyway. And Kenny isn't terrible. He does have a few of those predictable moments where somehow the little kid in the room outsmarts the whole military and all the scientists. But it's not often, and it doesn't rub your face in it the way the Gamera films do. And actually, one of the things that works really nicely is that there is exposition involving Hedorah, and the fact that Kenny is curious about it, and Kenny has this relationship with his dad, the scientist. A lot of the little science plan lessons we're having knock out exposition that would otherwise be really forced and clunky, and it's charming and it gets the job done effectively. So I don't absolutely hate the inclusion of the kid in this plot. There are weird moments. I think it more in editing that where Kenny is and why he's there seems to be problematic at times. There's the weird thing where he's on the roller coaster and he sees Godzilla in the background, and suddenly he knows that means the Smog monster's there, and he's just gone. It's very bizarre. Anyway, I guess maybe use that segue into the directing style here of Yoshimitsu Banno, which is fascinating. And I'm going to have to try and keep myself on track here, because I could ramble forever about this dude and his interesting technique. I would say overall, this film is a treat for kaiju fans. As compared to Jun Fukuda or almost every director in the Heisei period, a lot of the Millennium period, Banno is a man who really appreciates what the medium of film does and takes advantage of it. The cinematography in this film is very well executed. There are a lot of shots that if you just slow down, took a picture of, you could make an artsy poster and put it in someone's room, and people would question, be fascinated with that picture. The special effects too are really, they're very strong, and it's very exciting that for once we are not overloaded on stock footage. As far as I could tell, there was none. And some of the shots of Hedorah, especially in the water, leaping out of the water, attacking the ships, it's some of the best monster cinematography, I think, in the 70s period, which is admirable. I understand he had one production team to do both the monster scenes and the human scenes. On top of that, Toho gave him a pretty tight budget, and I think just a little over a month to film this entire thing. What they pulled off is pretty admirable in my opinion. But you know what? But I'll start with the very first scene, because I think that's kind of what lets you know just how smart of a director he really is. I'm not saying it isn't a crazy movie, but I'm saying he knows what he is doing behind a camera more so than a lot of Toho veterans, in my opinion. So the first sequence, after we've gotten the Save the Earth song out of the way, which, dear God, goes forever, we have Kenny in his backyard. He comes out. We see all these beautiful flowers. We see what a lovely, backyard he has. He's a kid in nature. He's exactly what a little kid should be experiencing. The camera kind of rotates around, so the camera's off to his left, and we see Mount Fuji in the background. So here it's a few seconds, and we've already got a kid with nature. We've set up this idea. We see Mount Fuji looking just beautiful and stunning right behind him, which later the ultimate battle shows up on Fuji. So right away, Mount Fuji is in the audience's mind, but then it rotates onto the other side of Kenny. And we see industrial Japan. I'm not too sure where they technically live, but you see the smokestacks, and you see the smog, and you see everything. And right away, within seconds, he sets up the very discussion of here's the future generation. Here's the next group of kids growing up to be the next generation. On one side, they have beautiful nature. On the other side, they have the slowly encroaching smog and pollution. And immediately he has given you the heart of his movie, the heart of the discussion, and the major thematic elements he wants you to be thinking about through this film. Also interesting to me, and this is more my theory, is so we've got Godzilla toys, and we have Kenny like shooting them down the slide. Again, my theory, I think he's subtly jabbing even the film project itself, that Godzilla is a franchise, and these big franchise movies go on to create a bunch of merchandise and product and advertising, which a lot of it ultimately ends up being waste and pollution. And it's not just that, it's that he's got multiple Godzillas, each one goes down the slide like the other one, he gathers them up, they go down the slide again. I think he could be doing anything with these Godzilla toys, but he keeps sending them down the slide, and we, the audience, have to watch it. I think Bano is subtly jabbing the whole idea of the franchise in general, and is kind of giving you a wink-wink, like, here comes another Godzilla right down the assembly line. Get ready, folks. But fortunately, he does mix it up, and I mentioned this briefly earlier. He brings a really heavy level of political discussion to this film. Again, I don't know anything since, I mean, maybe Mothra versus Godzilla, but certainly not since the original Gojira has it ever been this heavy-handed. And he uses a lot of interesting techniques to get that across. Clearly he wants the film to appeal to the younger generation, but he's also having a discussion with that younger generation. You know, as I mentioned before, the weird club dance sequence where our hippie main dude is dropping acid, he's hallucinating, all the people are dancing fish. It's crazy, and it might just be there to be crazy and give you a quick little visual punch, wake up the audience. I think part of it, too, though, is the question of, would we expect humans to live in filth the way we are expecting the fish? And the fish are a constant reoccurring image throughout this movie. He's very specific about his imagery. We're constantly seeing the big aquarium in the doctor's lab and all these beautiful, healthy fish. And then we're sliding over to the wall with all the disgusting, rotted, putrid, absolutely disgusting looking fish in the jar. And Bano is, again, he is right in his audience's face. Which one do you want? Do you want the healthy, vibrant, colorful fish? Do you want the putrid, rotting ones? The opening credit sequence, the song kind of drives me nuts. But he does a great job. He really lets the camera sit for a while on the images of all the pollution, the rotting nastiness in the ocean. And it's nauseating. I mean, I saw this movie when I was a little kid. Actually, here I'll bring up when I went back to Montana, I found my original VHS copy, which we had to order from a retailer in Japan, because in Helena, Montana in 1997, finding a copy of the Smog Monster was damn near impossible. So my dad ordered me this copy. That's fun. But because the film is pretty reminiscent for me, I tried really hard to kind of just take the movie in this time and forget about your previous impressions. And I was really struck this time with how disgusting so much of the scenery is. How disgusting Hedorah actually is. The sequence where it's sucking up the pollution into its lungs is actually a phenomenal effect. And you see it's growing, it's expanding, it's like a rancid shit balloon. And it's got this putrid, like, yellow vein covering going. They spent some time making sure this monster looks sick. And I noticed, too, a lot of the times you saw the pollution floating on top in the ocean, you'd get, like, the reds of the rotten fish meat and then the black of the sludge. So the sludge, the pollution, actually does start to look like Hedorah's form, with the bright red eyes, the weird pulsing red forehead thing, and the grayish, blackish, dirty kelp texture it has. You know, that reminds me though, and I have no answer for this. I noticed there's a number of times characters are wearing that same color combination of like red, gray, and black. And for a while I was thinking, you know, I think it's the hippie's girlfriend, the scene where she's in the car and it's getting sucked up by the smog monster, she's wearing it. And I thought, is that, you know, are we foreshadowing like whoever's wearing Hedorah's colors? I don't think the theory goes anywhere. I think he's maybe just, to Bano, it is an upsetting color palette and he wants to keep it fresh in your mind. As I was mentioning, this discussion about the future generation, the old generation, he hits you with some kind of alarming imagery to remind you of this a few times. The first one is the kitten on the stairs. Poor kitty. It's weird, and I guess I have two dueling theories here. One being that it is the suggestion, and I think this is a theme throughout the film, that Hedorah is the antithesis of life. Hedorah does not eat grass or absorb fish or enjoy the air the way everything else on Earth does. It destroys it. It kills whatever it touches, and it doesn't get nutrients from it. And so by rejecting the kitten, the very cute kitten, it is laying that foundation that we have life and then we have Hedorah. And Hedorah is exactly what we can't have on this Earth anymore. But I think the next layer of it is this idea of the next generation covered in shit because this generation fucked up so bad. It could have been a cat, it could have been a lot of things, but it is very obviously a kitten. The more obvious image is the baby in the sludge. It's during that weird moment where we have all the crazy television panels screaming at you and we have people fighting. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the movie because it very efficiently captures the chaos and the fear of what a nation of people now who cannot go outside. They don't know if they ever get to go outside. And even then the smog monster can just tear over your building, wreck your building, poison the air around you. It's a very dangerous monster. It's not something you can just get out of the way with like some of the other kaiju. So I love the little scene with all the TVs and the media yelling at you. But one of the first images, and it's maybe one of the most upsetting in the whole film, is there is a baby. And the baby is like sludge up to its neck, like it's about to choke and die on the sludge, and it is just screaming and screaming, and it's, you know, that's one of those like noises, like human evolution. We hear a baby crying and it irritates us for a reason because it makes us want to respond and help the baby. Yeah, I think right there, that is his most obvious, least subtle image. Bam, in your face. The next generation is going to grow up in sludge. Are you okay with that? Now, there's the weird question of kind of this middle generation, being the hipster, the acid-dropping hipster, brother to the doctor and his girlfriend. And, you know, they get up on Mount Fuji, they want this huge protest, they're going to do something right. I never really thought about it much. I kind of parsed them in with Kenny as being genuinely concerned and concerned for the right reasons. Whenever I do get ready for these reviews, I try and look up online. I look up, you know, some history details, but I also try and find different opinions. And one person wrote a review that thought that Bano actually really hated the hippie hipsters. And that's why they all get wiped out at the end. It's one of the more brutal sequences in a kaiju film. All these teenagers, 20-something-year-olds, are up there partying, jamming with their guitars, and the smog monster shows up, shit's toxic all over their face. We see our main hippie hipster die. Don't see that in many kaiju films. And then this black cloud just, and everyone's dead, and you just see all the nasty, rancid covered bodies everywhere. I'm kind of torn. I thought that was an interesting idea, especially when you consider that moment where they kind of abandon Kenny at the amusement park. It's like they're not even very responsible themselves. They're at a club singing, dancing, drinking. again, I'm not sure how I necessarily feel about it, but I thought it was an interesting idea to throw out there that Bano himself actually is pretty critical of the hipster club that says they care and want to do something, but actually doesn't do anything. I mean, they're up there playing instruments. How is that helping anything? Uh, a topic that remains relevant always for us, doesn't it? Um, I guess the final point I'll bring up in regards solely to his direction, and this, I'll warn you, heads up, this again is me kind of theorizing some of this. I mentioned at the top of the review, there's an interesting, like, sexual undercurrent to this film, which is something we really don't see in these films, especially previous to this time period. So, most Godzilla fans have probably heard this. Hedorah's eyes are designed very specifically after a certain part of the female anatomy. I think they call it a vagina. Uh, it's a very weird choice. You know, at this point, I think this starts like in the mid '60s. You know, we have our sexual revolution, but we're also seeing advertisers and filmmakers utilizing subliminal imagery and subtext into their stuff. There's a very famous, I think it was a Coke or a Pepsi ad in magazines, and the ice cubes, you can see they've got like pretty suggestive images within the ice cubes. It's just subtle enough you're not going to notice it, but it's totally there. And Stanley Kubrick is fascinated by this. Actually, The Shining, going into The Shining, he did a lot of research into subliminal advertising, subliminal messages. And Bano is kind of, a lot of the reasons he got this job is because of some of his cutting edge work with film, that he was, I think, seen by the studio as like a very progressive director of the future. So I can't help but think he was aware of these trends and maybe did try to implement them. So some of the other weird things that's part of this sexual undercurrent, well, the club scene, we have our hipster girlfriend up there in a bodysuit that is heavily suggestive of nudity. In fact, when I was a little kid and first saw this, I did think they just painted stuff over her naughty bits. I couldn't really wrap my mind around, like, why would you put on a flesh-colored bodysuit? Other than, I guess, Katsura's boob in Terror of Mechagodzilla, you don't really ever see the suggestion of nudity within these films. I mean, she's got kind of this Earth Mother painting going on, but it's there. The other one that kind of screams at me are the initial Hedorah babies, I guess. He could have modeled them after fish, which almost would have made more sense considering how much fish imagery we get in this film, but they're not. They're tadpoles, and we keep talking about them as tadpoles and referencing to them as tadpoles, and everybody knows tadpoles look like sperm cells. Am I reaching here? Perhaps a little bit. But I just, why the vagina eye? And then when I started thinking about that more and more, now what is that saying? What's all the imagery there for? Kind of two schools of thought you could throw out here. One being that the idea is just to make you uncomfortable. That when you're looking at Hedorah, you're not processing, I'm looking at genitals, but something just feels off, like you're looking at something you're not supposed to. It's just there to make you kind of uncomfortable. That's the style like Kubrick uses. At least certain film theorists think he used very heavily for The Shining. That even scenes where everything looks very normal, there's actually a bunch of images twisting your brain and your stomach in knots. So by the end of the film, you're really uncomfortable and you're not even sure why. The other theme, the reason he might be applying some sexual imagery in this movie, is that discussion again of life versus death I was talking about, Hedorah being the utter antithesis of it. And well, over potentially the idea of overpopulation too, that the reproductive act that we are glamorizing in media, and after the sexual revolution we're getting more comfortable glamorizing, well, especially in Japan. In Japan at about this time, the the whole film industry is caving in. The only films making really good money right now are porno films. And it's that way for almost the next decade. It's a big deal. It's the defining franchise. And Bano might be commenting on that to an extent too, that we need to slow down with that. There's already too many freaking people in Tokyo. Don't worry about getting your rocks off. Go jerk off or something and handle yourself for a while, people. I haven't been able to find anyone who really goes into this, but I think it is there. So food for thought, folks. Tell me what you think. So to start wrapping this up, some of the other issues I guess people bring up with the film, the soundtrack, who I believe is Riicho Manabe. Again, the film is so nostalgic for me, it's hard not to enjoy it. I kind of like the soundtrack. I can totally understand why people don't. Godzilla's theme especially, it's bizarre. The term I've seen applied to it that I think is the most accurate is drunken. But I kind of like the way it starts off menacing. It's got the big brassy horns, and then it goes into kind of this weird, it sounds like almost a samurai folk hero thing, but it's also brooding. It's very foreboding. It isn't the happy moment music. It's not an Ifukube military march, that's for damn sure. For me personally, it kind of has the effect like Mechagodzilla does, where it almost seems like it just shouldn't work at all. It's so disconnected that it can't help but be kind of a charming juxtaposition. It just maybe just wakes you up a little bit and lets you think. The first time you hear the Godzilla theme, though, it's why is Godzilla there? Who knows? It's a fantastic entrance, though, with that giant bright red sun, and he's just creeping in out of the corner. It's a fantastic entrance for the King of the Monsters. It's a shame they did nothing to support it or justify it or explain. I mean, there's a scene where Godzilla's just floating in the ocean, shooting at the pollution, setting it on fire. And I'm not sure to this day if that's supposed to be in Kenny's imagination or if that actually happened. It's in general, it is very much a passion project. You can tell these people really cared about this film, and I think it does a whole lot more right than wrong. That said, I understand why it's conflicting, and that, like, it might be part of what Bano is getting us to with this film. He is constantly giving you two images. Do you want the rotted, terrible world, or do you want healthy, fresh world? Do you want the fish? Do you want Mount Fuji? Or do you want the pollution? And so in some ways, I think the film is struggling with itself on purpose that way. That said, though, as a kaiju film, it's paced too well to be a bad kaiju film. Anytime I hear people say that he forgets it's a kaiju film, I think Hedorah got way more screen time than a lot of monsters do in these films. Ibra Horror of the Deep, how long is Ibra actually in that movie? What does Ibra actually get to do? Hedorah, we get to see a lot of Hedorah. We get to see the damage and the consequences of this monster. I don't think he ignored the fact that he was directing a kaiju film. It's a shame Tomoyuki Tanaka hated this movie. Hated. Most fans probably know, but he accused Bano of basically ruining the whole franchise with this film. It surprises me, because honestly, Godzilla's Revenge, and then you think about Megalon, and you think, God, that was the one Tomoyuki Tanaka really hated? Really, of all of them, that was the problem film? Another interesting note, I read online that they did actually have Ishiro Honda watch, I think, a few of the first rough cuts to give him advice and steer him. And I think it shows. I think unlike Fukuda, who doesn't set up shots, has very weak human interaction in a lot of the films, I think it shows that this guy was really trying. So let's call it there, kaiju fans. Thank you for everyone who's been subscribing, leaving comments. I always like to hear people's feedback. I am also taking requests now, apparently. I've got a few more on the list and a few that I personally am hoping to tackle. And God willing, my schedule allows me to do it in the coming weeks here. Anyway, I'm the Kaijuologist. I'm signing off from Denver, Colorado. We are the Mile High City, and we are getting higher all the time. Till next time.